Hello and welcome back to World 360. Has some relief emerged for protesters in Iran? And what's the deeper message behind Pakistan's brief ban on Wikipedia? These are some of the questions that we'll be tackling in today's episode. So first up, Iran. As you know, protests have been raging in Iran since last September and has posed one of the biggest challenges to Iran's theocracy since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. What first began as an agitation for women's rights and against the hijab slowly turned into a larger nationwide protest against several of the Iranian regime's policies. The Iranian regime responded with a harsh clampdown on protesters, and security forces reportedly killed and wounded several dozen of them last year. Human rights organizations say at least 517 protesters have been killed since last September, and over 19,000 people have been put behind bars, including about 50 journalists. Keep in mind that after China, Iran carries out the most executions in the world, so it was no surprise that according to some reports, protesters have also been executed. In fact, last month, 2 men convicted of allegedly killing a paramilitary volunteer during a protest were hanged. The men were also charged with corruption on earth, a Quranic term that carries the death penalty. The men are said to be among the 16 Iranian protesters who have been sentenced to death in closed-door hearings. The international community has sharply criticized the Iranian regime, including the country's supreme leader, for its suppression of the protests. It's also thrown a spanner in the works of reviving the Iran nuclear deal, something US President Joe Biden has been trying to do after his predecessor Donald Trump pulled out of the deal. But amid all this, there appears to be some respite for protesters in Iran. Earlier this week, the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, agreed to a limited pardon to be offered to many detained protesters. However, this does not include dual nationals and those charged with corruption on earth, which carries the death penalty. Also, those charged with spying for foreign agencies or those tied to groups hostile to Iran would also be excluded. These other 2 charges are key because as the protests gained momentum last year, Iran started blaming the US and Israel for them. In fact, in October, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said riots had been engineered by Iran's arch enemies and their allies. But what do these conditional pardons allowed by the Iranian regime mean? For one, they could offer some form of respite to protesters who could see their sentences reduced or pardoned in some cases. Then again, they are heavily conditioned as well. Naturally, those who do not express regret for their activities and give a written commitment not to repeat those activities will not be pardoned, said Iran's deputy judiciary chief on February 5th. However, the timing of the announcement is also important. The pardons were announced ahead of the 44th anniversary of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Pardons are common ahead of the anniversary. In fact, in February 2022, the supreme leader reduced the sentences of about 3,000 prisoners, and in 2021, he pardoned about 1,800 prisoners to celebrate a Shiite festival. So it's hard to tell whether this is a real olive branch extended to protesters or a political stunt. Now on to Hong Kong, where after nearly 2 years, pro-democracy protesters are participating in a landmark trial, almost like a mass trial, in which 47 accused were jailed. Let's rewind to October 2019 when the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong reached a peak. Protesters who were fighting against Hong Kong's plans to allow extradition to mainland China clashed with the police. One protester was shot in the chest with a live bullet. Images of tear gas shells and water cannons dominated newspaper pages in those months. Later, the Hong Kong government decided to withdraw its controversial extradition bill, but it was too late. Public sentiment went far beyond the extradition bill at that point. Mass protests went strong for nearly a year before coming to an end in November 2020, and several were detained. Fast forward to the present day, where 47 high-profile detainees like scholar Benny Tai and activists Joshua Wong and Lester Shum have begun hearings as part of a large national security trial. Keep in mind that this is more than 2 years after the protests came to an end. In these 2 years, Hong Kong's core electoral system was changed and a new China-leaning government was installed. Also, a controversial national security law introduced in June 2020 to rein in protesters continues to be wielded by the island state. So in short, this is the Hong Kong government's case against the protesters. They have been accused of political conspiracy to subvert state power. Out of 47 defendants, about 18 of them have pled not guilty. It is not a crime to act against a totalitarian regime, said one of the protesters in court. For our last topic, we're going to try and decode Pakistan's recent ban on Wikipedia, which only lasted a few days. On Tuesday, the Shehbaz Sharif-led government in Pakistan lifted a brief ban on Wikipedia. On 1st February, Pakistan's Telecom Authority announced that it would be clamping down on Wikipedia in the country after the website failed to remove what the Pakistan government termed as sacrilegious content. After 2 days, the website was banned. However, there was no clarity on what exactly this sacrilegious content was. When the ban was finally lifted, there was still no clarity on whether the offensive content was removed or not. Let's not forget that this entire incident comes on the heels of Pakistan National Assembly's decision last month to unanimously pass the Criminal Laws Amendment Act 2023, which are essentially new blasphemy laws. In Pakistan, blasphemy laws have been criticized as arbitrary, and blasphemy itself has emerged as a particularly sensitive topic. Many of the blasphemy laws being followed in the country today are those codified by the British back in 1947. The new blasphemy laws passed last month build on these existing ones and have increased the minimum punishment for those who insult the revered personalities of Islam from 3 to 10 years, along with a fine of 1 million rupees. The concept of blasphemy has also been wielded by politicians in Pakistan, mainly the TLP. For example, late Sunni cleric Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who founded TLP, had shot to prominence over a decade ago when he accused his political opponent at the time of committing blasphemy against Prophet Muhammad. Blasphemy later became a key element of his political agenda. Then there's the infamous case of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman who was imprisoned after being wrongfully accused of blasphemy following a squabble with Muslim women in her village. She even faced a death penalty. According to Ahmed T. Kuru, a professor of political science at the San Diego State University, Pakistan has the world's second strictest blasphemy laws after Iran, and about 1,500 Pakistanis have been charged with blasphemy over the past 30 years. He added that blasphemy laws historically emerged to serve the political and religious authorities, and they continue to have a role in silencing dissent in many Muslim countries. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.